Hello, and welcome to Week 18's lecture, Late Woodland to 1600. So last week we discussed the Mississippian societies roughly to 1500. But what was going on in regions around the Mississippian area not dominated by Mississippi cultures? In our course text, Alice Kehoe discusses all the areas around the Mississippi, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the Mid-Atlantic region. Today, I'm actually just going to focus specifically on groups that came to inhabit Ontario. So the Algonquians and the Iroquoians. And I'm going to look at the larger region that the Algonquians and Iroquoians inhabited, which is that of the larger Northeast. So this lecture is going to be broken down into 3 sections. The first section is going to be on Algonquian speakers. The second section is actually going to be a case study of one group of Algonquian speakers, those who lived in the Potomac country. And then the third section is going to be on Iroquoian speakers. I added a 4th section to this lecture. So this 4th section is a case study of the Seed Barker site. That's an archaeological dig site that's really close to York University. It's actually just up in Vaughan. And it's of a typical late Iroquoian village that's made up, I think, of Proto-Wendat people. And it's from the years 1400 AD to 1650 AD. So this 4th section, this lecture, is going to be given to you by an archaeologist whose name is Bob Berger. And he's going to be talking to you about the practice of archaeology at this site. He's also going to be talking about the emergence of local ethnicities, and he's going to be focusing in on trying to get close to the actual people who left the archaeological remains. Section 1, Algonquian speakers. We are now moving closer to the time of European contact, and we have access to their writings, both for contemporary impressions and for ethnographic descriptions, which we can use for the method of upstreaming, which I talked about in the last lecture. So in the last few lectures, we've started to incorporate some written sources, starting with the Mexican accounts. A few were written before the Spanish conquistadors arrived, and of course many more after they were there. And these have provided us with detailed portraits of many communities. Last week, we drew on a few scattered accounts from the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries, and discussed methods of how to use these accounts for our upstreaming. The big problem with European written sources is being able to read through the biases of their writings. So of course, all historical sources have biases of some sort. In this class, we've examined primarily certain sources and their biases, and these include primarily archaeological evidence, material culture. We've also looked at some oral traditions, some linguistic evidence, and of course some genetic evidence. So written sources really have to be subject to the same scrutiny. Even though they may bear a patina of truth, as they are something produced in the time period under study, and they have the appeal of like an eyewitness account, they absolutely reflect the perspective of the recorder, which was limited in myriad ways by what they experienced, and also colored by their prejudices, their interests, and of course their cosmologies, how they saw the world, and also by the categories that they had available to them to even recognize and describe what they saw. So let's take a look at the writings of one Jesuit missionary, Father Pierre Biard. He was sent to a mission in Acadia, in present-day Nova Scotia, in 1612. So the Jesuits all wrote regularly to their superiors in France, and these writings were widely circulated among the French public. The primary means of communicating what the Jesuits learned on the ground was in something that they called a relation, or relation. And this was a genre adopted by the Jesuits to report on their work in the mission field. So these ended up being very small books that were widely circulated, and they were generally filled with first-person reports on the Jesuits' experiences with evangelization, and also on their observations about the subjects of their efforts. And this was Indigenous peoples from the many places to which the Jesuits sent missionaries, and this really was all over the world. So these reports were all acts of translations. So not only did the Jesuits transmit information about the foreign cultures to European audiences, but they actually also required the technical skills of being a translator of foreign languages. So Jesuits actually became really well known for learning foreign languages, and the same is true of North American indigenous languages. So these relations contain both evidence of the Jesuits' cosmology, but also nuggets of genuine observations on Indigenous life, especially since most Jesuits were trained to be keen observers. All Jesuits were trained in observation, recording, and writing. Their educational system encouraged scientific inquiry, a high level of skilled communication, and a careful categorization of different types of information. They used their position as evangelists, working in the far corners of the known world, to engage in anthropological inquiry on a global scale. And they recorded encyclopedic quantities of information. So, and they actually were contributing to the very first global encyclopedias, but of course based in Europe. They were all well equipped to gather this wealth of scientific, linguistic, and cultural data because of their efforts to evangelize and civilize required a thorough understanding of the indigenous languages they encountered, as well as, of course, the beliefs, morals, and manners of the foreigners that they hoped to convert. The Jesuit missionary Pierre Biard wrote of the indigenous people he observed in Acadia, quote, "Their food is whatever you can get from the chase or hunt, and from fishing, for they do not till the soil at all." And end quote. You can see here his value judgment about farming. Quote, "In the month of February until the middle of March is the great hunt for beavers, otters, moose, and bears, and for the caribou, an animal half ass, half deer." End quote. So here we can see actually what indigenous peoples were hunting. Quote, "If the weather is then favorable, they live in great abundance, and are as haughty as princes and kings. But if it is against them, they are greatly to be pitied, and often die of starvation." End quote. So see, you're learning that Pierre Biard comes from a world where it's really only princes and kings that are allowed to hunt. So he's kind of incensed that all these indigenous peoples are hunting all over the place. But we also can actually look through his own cultural bias and cultural preoccupations to see evidence of how short-term changes affected economic activities. So let's turn to another European who wrote a lot about the indigenous people that he encountered in the New World. And that's Giovanni de Verrazzano, who was a Florentine explorer of North America, trained in much the same manner as Jesuits to be keen observers. But he was primarily interested in economic opportunities rather than evangelical opportunities. And in 1524, he wrote of the kind of middle U.S. coastline. Quote, "When we went further inland, we saw their houses, which are circular in shape, about 14 to 15 paces across, made of bent saplings." End quotes. And to me, this information seems so specific that it seems plausible. Why would he invent, a particular shape of a house, a particular amount of paces across, and the fact that it was made of bent saplings? So when you're reading these sources, you kind of have to think of all these things. Is it so specific that it really kind of can't be made up? Let's turn to a third European writer. This one's name is Daniel Gookin. He was an Irish settler in the British colonies of Virginia, and later he moved up to Massachusetts. And he himself struggled to be a farmer, and kind of unsuccessfully. But he wrote in 1674 of indigenous people, quote, "Their food is generally boiled maize or Indian corn mixed with kidney beans, and sometimes without. Also, they frequently boil in this potage or soup fish and flesh of all sorts, either new taken or dried, as shads, eels, alewives, or a kind of herring, or any other sort of fish. Also, they mix with the said potage several sorts of roots, also several sets of nuts of masts." End quote. So that would be like acorns from oak trees, for example. So, and Gookin sounds pretty darn hungry to me, so kind of obsessed with food. But again, he lists all these specific resources. Of course, he's excited about the resources he's seeing in the New World, but he's also, pretty darn jealous and also interested in learning from the indigenous people and what they ate. So all of these 17th century accounts of indigenous peoples in the Southeast are a palimpsest of impressions, accurate and inaccurate, tantalizing and confusing. So by this time, in the 1600s, coastal people in the Northeast had been in contact with Europeans for some time, possibly even as early as the mid 1400s, especially with Basque and Portuguese fishers who'd been sporadically trading furs with them when they occasionally passed by on their coasting ships, usually on the Grand Banks, fishing. And then by the time the Pilgrims actually arrived in Plymouth Rock in New England and Massachusetts in 1620, an indigenous man named Samoset was able to actually fluently say in English to the arriving Pilgrims, "Welcome, Englishmen." The annual round of summer fishing and foraging in the Northeast, and also of winter caribou and moose hunting and winter forest trapping, still flourished as it had for thousands of years, ever since archaic times. So to understand the complicated ancestry of these northeastern tribes, it's necessary to go back in time, returning to the late archaic period. People living in coastal drainage areas between Nova Scotia and North Carolina were Algonquian speakers. So Algonquian is a large linguistic and cultural family that spans the largest area in Canada today and a big part of the United States. And it includes a lot of groups that are well known to us, like Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Chippewa, Cree, Mi'kmaq in the east, and also Abenaki. They are grouped into the Eastern Algonquian language group and isolated from their northern and western relatives by speakers of another linguistic and cultural group. And these were Iroquoian speakers. So Iroquoian speakers kind of served as a wedge to break up the Eastern Algonquian speakers and then the rest of the Algonquian speakers further to the north and further to the west. So all the Algonquian speakers in the West actually all have oral histories of a westward migration, probably right from the Atlantic coast. And so most scholars assume that they migrated westward over time. So the origins of Algonquian speakers are still a mystery, but a form of this language group probably goes very far back into a past, to a time when ancient cultures in the eastern woodlands were more widespread and generalized than they were in later times. Both Algonquian and Gulf languages may perhaps be descended from a common group of related dialects once spoken throughout the eastern woodlands before 4000 BCE. The northern Iroquois languages formed the most important barrier between the coastal Algonquian speakers and those to the west. So they're like this insulating block from central Pennsylvania through New York State and along the St. Lawrence River to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Atlantic Ocean. Their descendants today are the Wendats, or also known as the Huron, Eries, and the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is made up of 6 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. So the Haudenosaunee were split into 2 groups during the American Revolution between 1765 and 1783. So those fighting on the American side still reside in their traditional territories in upstate New York, and those who fought on the side of the British Crown moved into Ontario, Upper Canada at that time, as British Loyalists, and today they occupy a reserve near Brantford, Ontario. So most linguistic experts agree that Iroquoian language distribution represents an ancient intrusion of a different linguistic group into the Northeast, a group later associated with the powerful Iroquois confederacies that dominated a vast region between the St. Lawrence and New York at the time of European contact, mid to late 16th century and then early 17th century. So how did Iroquoian speakers come to be living in the lower Great Lakes area with Algonquians all around them in a territory that was once Algonquian? The Iroquois are known as fierce warriors, shrewd traders, and very sophisticated negotiators. They played a dominant role in the Northeast until the end of the colonial period and even beyond. So today they're one of the most powerful Indigenous groups in Canada and the United States, and most Iroquoian communities maintain their sovereignty and do not believe they were ever colonized by Europeans. They actually had their own seat at the League of Nations after World War I, and until 9/11, they were able to use their own passports recognized by the Canadian and US governments, and even internationally. So a central question in northeastern archaeology is to establish when Iroquoian speakers first spread into their present homelands, and to identify them in the archaeological record. So to do so, they go back and look at the late archaic cultures in the Northeast. So, and they start with a period, or they look at a period that's often called the Terminal Archaic, 1650 BCE to 700 BCE. So throughout the eastern woodlands, rivers large and small were arteries that flowed through the centers of archaic territories. They provided not only aquatic resources and sustenance for plant and animal populations on their banks, but also vital communication arteries between widely scattered hunter-gatherer populations. The higher ground between the river valleys served as boundary land, sometimes remote, sometimes traversed by narrow trails, and often serving as little more than a place where neighbors might hunt and collect wild vegetable foods. In the archaic Northeast, one can think of these high lands as buffers between different population concentrations. And these population concentrations were controlled in large part by the carrying capacity of the land during the leanest months of the year. And the leanest months would be in the winter and early spring. So for thousands of years, ancient populations in the Northeast were fairly stable at levels below the carrying capacity of the land. Population growth was incredibly slow. So scholars think that no more than 25,000 people lived in New England before 8000 BCE, and only between 158,000 and 191,000 in AD 1600. So archaeologist Dean Snow has calculated an average growth rate of 0.02% over 9,600 years, with occasional periods of rapid increase and sometimes catastrophic decline. So in contrast, the world population increase rate has been as high as 1.8% in recent years. So this population spacing of 0.02% growth lasted for thousands of years, only beginning to break down during the last 6 centuries before European colonization. The stable population rate reflects that people lived close to or comfortably within the carrying capacity of the land. The increases in the 600 years before Europeans arrived marks the introduction of horticulture and new food storage techniques, which allowed higher population densities in many parts of the Northeast. Okay, fishing was an important late archaic activity. And fishing, was a way in which Northeasterners gathered sustenance both before and after agriculture was adopted. So we know how important fishing is from excavations under Boylston Street in the heart of Boston, where extensive fish weirs have been excavated since the 1940s. The weirs were in use for over 16 centuries after 3300 BCE, and the weir alone required more than 65,000 stakes, each up to 2 meters long, many of them fashioned from saplings, perhaps grown by coppicing. So coppicing is a method of woodland management where young trees are grown from stumps or roots, and then they're repeatedly cut down to ground level to continuously encourage new growth. So after 1650 BCE, the archaic communities of the Northeast enjoyed a diverse and carefully scheduled hunting and gathering lifeway. Archaeologists call this then the Terminal Archaic period, and it spanned about 10 centuries until about 700 BCE. So it was a period marked by long-distance trading of chert, of soapstone or steatite, and other such stone materials, and also by the widespread use of soapstone bowls and the use of both broad and of narrow fishtail stone projectile points. So many local cultural traditions flourished during this period. The so-called Susquehanna tradition of New York, Pennsylvania, and neighboring areas flourished during the earlier centuries of the Terminal Archaic, And remember, this is circa 1650 to 1320 BCE. So it was a widespread tradition marked by a variety of broad projectile points that may have also doubled as knives. The Susquehanna is more of a tradition of point manufacture than an actual cultural complex. The Orient tradition then replaced the Susquehanna tradition in the New York region, and it's characterized, instead of having really broad blades, by long, narrow points with these fishtail-shaped bases, and that persisted during the later woodland cultures as well. Oval and rectangular soapstone bowls with flat bottoms and lug handles that appear to have been copies of wooden prototypes came into widespread use, especially in large base camps. So these artifacts were also used by Susquehanna people. These large bowls were heavy cooking vessels, and they were apparently really highly prized, traded widely, and really enjoyed long lives of use. The use of these stone vessels foreshadowed pottery manufacture after 700 BCE. So Susquehanna and Orient cultures or traditions flourished alongside other traditions like the lake forest, archaic, and mast forest societies in many areas, with much human settlement concentrated near rivers and coasts. So this millennia-old tradition included cremating people, and that was pretty much a steady practice all the way through. So we do see some population movements from New York and southern New England into the more northern areas over time. These population movements and the population growth that may have attended them are still little understood, but scholars do think that they were encouraged by a general warming trend and a stabilization of sea levels. So there's strong evidence for a general cultural continuity in economic and social life over much of the Northeast from early in the archaic times. And then until AD 800, this continued. But we do have insufficient evidence to argue whether or not there were continuity in population sizes as well. Okay, let's turn our attention to a more recent period then, the woodland societies in the Northeast, roughly from 700 BCE to AD 1000. So the Algonquians of New England and the Atlantic coastal plain lived near the northernmost limit of maize cultivation and the southernmost extent of Atlantic salmon migration. So these people exploited both fish and the tropical cultigens to the point where they could have congregated in large villages, as did the Iroquois, which I'm going to be discussing later on in the lecture. But many of them chose not to, or so we think. So at least any large Algonquian villages in this area have yet to come to light, although scholars speculate that there may have been occasional Algonquian groups that did congregate in large villages, created circular villages, made thatched houses, and these would have been spaced around a central square. And this is like many other settlement types in the eastern woodlands during this period. We do know that most groups, like the Mississippians, lived in the alluvial floodplain environments where soils were the most fertile, but where settlements were probably periodically destroyed by floods or soils washed away through erosion. So the inhabitants practiced shifting agriculture, so they probably did not leave many artifacts or substantial hut foundations behind, and hence any evidence of these villages is then incredibly hard to find. So like many first Americans, their archaeological signature is very scanty. So it is not surprising that these settlements have yet to be discovered, if they did exist. Maize agriculture was an important feature of indigenous economies at European contact, and it was grown in large quantities in the Connecticut Valley and other river systems centuries earlier, and apparently large quantities of grain were stored in granaries located on well-drained gravelly soils on river terraces. So the date of the introduction of maize continues to be a matter of some controversy. So corn was certainly grown by the last millennium AD, perhaps as early as the 7th century BCE. Traces of farming villages have come from strip mining operations, but no one has been able to excavate an entire village or cemetery that might have accompanied it. We are almost certain that people moved to different locations throughout the seasons, following resources, dispersing to hunt deer, and perhaps to trade or take a beaver, which was a known activity that Europeans witnessed at later times. So scholars have wondered how gender might have affected these activities. We know that Europeans observed women taking care of fields while men were sent off to hunt and fish, but we don't know how far back this gendered pattern of economy went. Woodland cultures in the Northeast are still poorly defined, with subdivisions based on artifact changes and cultural historical formulations that really, by today's standards, they're just too rigid to make any sense. So at the time, local populations, we know, were relatively sparse, with the densest concentrations scattered in bands living in territories of widely differing sizes of river drainages near lakes and along seacoasts. So pottery appears mainly in local horticultural communities by the late first millennium BCE, but the moment of appearance varied greatly. So the increased use of pottery signaled a trend towards more sedentary settlement over the centuries. Small cooking pots with pointed bases, decorated with stamped and cord-marked patterns, and manufactured with that simple coiling method, were commonly used throughout the Great Lakes region by about 500 BCE. And in New York State, the Meadowood phase provides strong hints of cultural influences from both earlier and contemporary cultural traditions. So the Meadowood phase is roughly around 700 BCE to roughly 300 CE or AD. So Meadowood sites do occur through the west and central New York State and into the Mohawk River drainage area to the east. The many Meadowood communities were probably anchored by large base camps, some of them perhaps semi-permanent settlements close to places where indigenous grasses were abundant. The resulting seed caches helped tide people over in lean months, as did the stored squash. So we have strong indications that Edina and then later Hopewell trade networks extended into parts of the Northeast and into Meadowood country. The Meadowood people fabricated their characteristic points and blade blanks from western Onondaga chert, and also they made clay imitations of Edina tubular stone pipes. So we also find among Meadowood people copper ornaments, slate gorgets, bird stones, and boat stones. And all of these are from Ohio, and they hint at Edina cultural influence that went far beyond simple trade and exchange. So Meadowood cemeteries were often clustered on low hills. The graves were closely packed together, the bodies usually cremated, but not always immediately after death. The mourners lined the burial pits with bark, laying out the cremated remains in red ochre-sprinkled shrouds. Projectile points and luxury items were usually buried with the dead, some of them obtained through the trade networks that extended far into the Midwest. So in time, these exchange activities brought Edina mortuary practices from their Ohio homeland into the Northeast, and it was reflected in later burial mounds containing Edina-like log-lined graves with characteristic artifacts like the tubular pipes, bird stones, and boat stones. So these burial mounds, also called tumuli, are scattered across southern Ontario, New Brunswick, New York, parts of southern and western New England, as well as into the Delaware drainage area. A widely adopted ideological system sustained later Hopewell exchange networks in the Midwest and far afield, reaching into New England. So the same may be true of the Edina mortuary complex, which lasted in parts of the Northeast from the mid-first millennium BCE for 7 centuries. So by the late first millennium AD, a great variety of horticultural societies had developed throughout the Northeast. Many of these societies were contemporary with the Hopewell tradition of the Midwest, but the Hopewell exchange networks actually never penetrated very far into New England. So in the Northeast, we're seeing far more of an Edina influence than a later Hopewell influence. And those Edina practices lasted for a long time and then became contemporaneous with the Hopewell traditions that were happening in Ohio and in the Midwest. So Despite widespread horticulture, the basic adaptation in southern New England had primordial roots in something called the mast forest archaic period of earlier millennia. So, mast forest archaic is both a culture and a biotic area. The biodome is oak, deer, maple, and the key resources obviously then were deer, turkey, nuts, and the typical indigenous crops of the eastern woodlands, especially the grasses. So we see increasing regional variation after 700 BCE. In some cases, winter hunting camps lay close to small streams and ponds in the backcountry. Shellfish collecting was important near the coast. So during the terminal Archaic, when the ocean temperatures were warmer than today, people were able to exploit bay scallops, oyster, and other shellfish that were actually too sensitive for cold water. So in contrast, earlier horticultural societies lived by colder seas and then relied actually on soft clams, which were the ones that could survive in the colder water. So you can see how changes to the local environments really changed the ways in which people practice their annual subsistence rounds. So Maine and northern societies never became cultivators, and they remained hunters, plant gatherers, and shellfish collectors. And it's just because they were too far north to have a decent growing season for any of the major domesticated plants. So people in these northern areas did adopt clay vessels at some point before the year zero, but that was considerably later than people to the south. Some of the coastal populations lived in substantial semi-subterranean pit dwellings. So these oval-shaped houses were between 11.4 and 13.1 feet long, and they had a sunken hearth near the entrance and elevated sleeping benches along the walls. So apparently they were conical wigwam or teepee-like structures excavated partially below the ground level, and these would provide obviously additional warmth and insulation. So, judging from animal bones, many coastal people dwelt in pit house communities for fall, winter, and spring, and then they probably moved inland during the summer in order to gather salmon, shad, and other fish and eels from the streams and lakes. So this same basic lifeway persisted among a great diversity of northeast coast populations in the coastal northeast up to and beyond European contact in the 16th and 17th centuries.